I'm going to have to close the door, sorry. Yeah.
And we're live. I'm delighted to welcome my buddy, Mateen Chaudhry, to Benny and the Squirrel. Mateen is a fellow Brit based in Australia. He's had an extraordinary background in Hong Kong, in Tokyo, owning trailer parks in the US, and then living in LA. But he's down in the lucky country now and spends an awful lot of time talking about Japan. Welcome, Mateen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So listen, I think we should kick off with Japan and the energy crisis, right?
Yep.
I mean, ultimately, if it's not first and foremost in people's minds right now, what does $100 crude look like for Japan if it's over a sustained period of time?
Yeah. So I think I wrote about this in one of my newsletters, Discuss the Tape, in December, that there were two things that might derail the excitement. One is a geopolitical risk, and the second one is inflation getting out of control in Japan. And unfortunately, this geopolitical risk is going to probably lead to an inflationary disaster in Japan. I think it's potentially as bad, and this might sound alarmist, but like the 1973 situation when the Yom Kippur War happened, this could continue for a while. And I think we've already seen foreign investors, maybe the East Coast funds, unwind some positions this week. The currency was flat and Toyota was down, I think, 5% on one day. And I think you're going to see more jittery price action, unfortunately. This is a problem because Japan obviously imports oil, imports liquid natural gas. And unfortunately, even though they've restarted the nuclear energy effort, it's nowhere near where it was in 2010, a year before the earthquake in Fukushima. Yeah. So it's very unfortunate. And I don't want to be too alarmist because who knows what happens. But I think you've just got to be mindful that Japan, like all the other Asian economies, are dependent on the Middle East for energy. Obviously, they can diversify to Australia and to the US, and Japan has made some efforts recently to do that, but the impact could be quite significant. So I'm a little bit cautious to recommend too many of the large cap stocks, which have actually been bought recently by foreign investors. Does that make sense?
Let's get to stocks in a minute. The only reason for letting this chart linger a bit longer on there is just an observation. During the sort of post-COVID energy spike, you'd have thought that the Nikkei would have done worse than just kind of treading water over that sort of 21 through 23 period. Any smart observations to make from that? I mean, what I'm trying to say is,
I think earnings growth was quite solid. 11%, 10% per annum. Dividends were being increased, maybe 12% on average. Obviously, you had buybacks. You had a lot of corporate reform. You had the restructuring of TSE. So there was a lot of positives for the market as well, right? Yeah. And that outweighed some of those issues. But let's be clear, I think those are still very much relevant to today. I think Japan is seeing earnings growth. The corporate reform is across the market. It's not just large caps, it's small caps as well. We've just been in Japan and it's very exciting. A lot of stuff that's going on. I just think you have to be mindful now, just for to see how this works out, because this is a serious problem. And unfortunately, it's not clear how to deal with it. So just in terms of the macro picture, if the trade deficit gets higher, yen will weaken. I think that's very likely. And obviously, the inflation issue is going to become a bigger problem. Lots of old people will have a tough time paying their electricity bills in the summer because Tokyo's particularly hot at the moment in the summer. I don't know what's happened. And all the people who have benefited from the rising share prices and house prices, which has been a feature of the Japanese economy, are now buying like nice places up in Hokkaido. But the average Joe, living in Tokyo is going to have a tough time. And so what does that mean for Takaichi-san? I think she's going to have to write checks to the population at some stage and do some subsidies for some of the old people, just because there's going to be a lot of pushback, and it's not her fault, but she's going to have to take some measures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I saw Ueda came out today, or maybe it was yesterday, I can't remember, and already said, oh, there's going to be some economic headwinds because of this Iran, which to me just, I was joking with Rupert, is just you're going to be more disappointment about rates not rising, basically with these guys. And so I'm with you. I think the yen weakening, dollar yen going up, is going to be the play. And I don't have a strong opinion on these stocks, but can I ask you what's the current surplus or inventory status they have there? Like thinking about like how much stocks do they have, and when does it become go from just like a worry to a real issue?
Well, I think LNG. I'll come back to the currency in a minute, because I think the BOJ might have to do something. But just with the inventory on LNG, I think there's not much at all, right? So I don't have the specific numbers, but I don't think there's much reserves at all. Oil, I think it's 50 to 100 days. I mean, it's that kind of level, which is a big concern, right? And that's where we're at. I mean, they stockpiled oil, as far as I can tell, but nowhere near like the Chinese did, right? So Japan, obviously recently, just in terms of the US investment framework, a lot of that was actually related to energy. And so there's been already a lot of investment into Wyoming and areas like Impex, I think, or Japex was investing, which is an oil and gas producer in the US recently. They have been trying to diversify away from the US, from the Middle East, but it's short term. It's going to be hard to actually solve this crisis. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Let's get back to the macro and the yen. I mean, Ben, this is music to Ben's ears as these long dollar yen digitals at 200. But ultimately, where the Bank of Japan loves to be late and slow on stuff, and they're being given plenty of excuses now. At some stage, the release valve probably is the currency. Is it time to hedge our Japanese equities?
I think 160 is the level that they will do something. Yeah. So I'll go on the record. And I think they could raise rates again, 25 pips. I think, to be fair to the BOJ, I know they get bashed a lot, especially by people like Kyle Bass and things. But, they've managed the bond market reasonably well over the last 25, 30 years. And yes, they could have acted sooner, but as you can tell, the economy obviously is showing signs of improvement. We were hoping for 3% nominal GDP growth this year. That's not going to happen probably now, but it's still kind of a fragile situation in terms of consumption, etc. So I think what they've done is be cautious, but at some point with the yen, they're going to have to intervene, because it can't go below 160.
Just for those following on at home, the lines here on this chart. Blue is dollar yen, black is the 10-year JGB yield, and then the bottom panel is the US Japan 2-year note yield differential, just in red there.
Yeah. So, so I think the BOJ, will be forced to do something, which is another problem, because there's a bigger, broader discussion here, guys, I think, which is lingering, right? We've got a private credit crisis in the US, right? And who has a lot of exposure to private credit and CLOs. It's Norin
Chukin.
Yeah, big voice.
And if I was like in a leadership position in Japan, they've got this stock trading mechanism called NISA, in that you can trade overseas stocks and Japan stocks. The first thing I would do is just limit that to Japan stocks, because personally I think the US's market's going to be vulnerable for a little while. But secondly, you should buy at home, because there's many great stories. The valuations are still great for a lot of names, right? But on a bigger, that's sort of said tongue in cheek, but in terms of bringing money home, right, what could this mean if the US rates go down, which in my view, this situation could be quite serious in the Middle East. What is the Fed going to have to do? And then you've got the BOJ raising. I mean, at some point this year, that might raise its ugly head. So I see great trading opportunities in Japan this year, right? Because there's some fantastic themes, and we talk about them in Kabu Japan. But I do think you need to be careful, right? I do think you need to be careful.
Let's dig into these let's dig into some of these themes, because frankly, I mean, I'm slightly in your camp at the macro level. I think this could go on a lot longer and be a lot more painful than people are thinking right now. Markets feel way too complacent.
I think so.
But just a quick shout out for what you and the team are doing at Kabu Japan. This is a brand new research product. So how long is it? 2 months old now?
Yeah, 2 months.
And you've just been coming out with some fantastic stuff. And just before you kick off, and I think we'll start with your rewiring Japan theme in a second, but just your background in Japanese equities, just so that people know, just very quickly.
Yeah, so ended up studying Japanese at Oxford, went to Waseda University for a year, ended up in investment banking, somehow, and then was on the trading floor for a long time, and in Hong Kong and Japan for UBS, JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, then in the US, in New York, where I did a global role. And so I've been looking at the market since the late 90s. We have a business that works with Japanese corporates, bring them overseas as separate business, and we run a corporate advisory business separate. But I write this newsletter called Discuss the Tape. A lot of people love the Japan content. They wanted more details, they wanted more ideas, and then a lot of other people were like, I don't want to hear about Japan. So I thought, we've got to do something about this. Let's set up a separate thing. We have a relationship with a Japanese broker, Tachibana Shoken, which is Tachibana Securities, and they cover they've got over 100 stocks, good analysts out there. And we, trying to bring ideas that are actionable, that are not necessarily large cap. Does that make sense? So we don't want to necessarily, everyone's got an edge on a view on MHI and FANUC and these kind of names. We're trying to find hidden value in some of the mid caps and small caps. And hopefully I think we've done okay recently.
No, you crushed it.
Can I ask you a question? In the US, we had my buddy Mike Green on, and Mike's a big proponent of this the impact of passive, and how it's been a negative for small caps. Is there some similar dynamics, or maybe the mechanics in Japan, or can you maybe talk to that? Like, I know options aren't nearly as much prevalent in that market. Maybe for our US listeners or European listeners, kind of just talk to how the market works relative to maybe the US market.
Well, yeah, there's definitely a passive element in passive accounts trading Japan. And I think that was particularly evident sort of early 2010s. They would have such significant impact on markets and move things in strange ways. The OTC, the option market is very light. It's all OTC. So it's not really, well, there is some listed stuff, but it's mostly OTC. But passive is relevant. And obviously you've got the government pension fund, which comes in and moves prices. So you have to be aware of it. And this is what makes Japan such an interesting market as well, because, and this is part of the reason why I'm suggesting they should try and beef up the domestic buying by retail is because there are all these tactical strategies in Japan you can have to trade. And part of that is trying to work out where the passive flows might be, versus the active. And in some names, it becomes very apparent. Does that make sense? Now, what's happened in Japan over the last, say, 5 years, I think, the Japanese small cap space, for me, is so much more interesting than the Russell 2000 because of actual real companies with earnings. And all of a sudden, people have found them and have discovered them, and retail are buying them, domestic institutions are buying them, and increasingly, they're getting a bit of coverage in the US. Does that make sense? So you're seeing some really interesting moves in some of the small caps finally, because sometimes you could own them maybe 10, 20 years ago, and they wouldn't move for 5 years, right? It was so painful. It made you question your life.
And the board of directors didn't care either, right?
They didn't care. They didn't care. So yeah. Benny, just to be clearer, so passive is a feature. I think GPF is a big factor in moving markets sometimes, less so recently. But there are passive accounts that do impact share prices, if that's okay. Whether it's on the level of the US, I don't know, to be honest.
Let's kick off with one of your big themes, Mateen, which is which you've been calling rewiring Japan. I mean, I guess most people will be familiar with the sort of the backlog in terms of grid infrastructure and stories like GE Vernova in the States. But give us the Japanese angle.
Well, in terms of there's I suppose a couple of angles really. The data center story in Japan is very much like the US. They need to develop these things, and what we have found is there were so many obvious plays a few years ago that were going to be providing widgets and components for these data centers over here, and the stocks were cheap. And importantly, they didn't have any ESOP dilution, right? Which is different from the US, right? So in the US, you can buy a stock like Palantir, and all of a sudden you're realizing that they're winning all the time. And you're not necessarily as a shareholder, even though obviously the stock went up. You don't have that dynamic in Japan. So some of those names like Fujikura and things like that have ripped, and some of the East Coast accounts, which Benny might be familiar with, have bought them, right? So that's the.
He used to be one of those East Coast accounts, very much.
Yeah, so I'm thinking Benny because of his past experience. I would imagine that. One of those guys might buy, but bought them. Now, in terms of the structural bottom in electricity consumption, which Jaya, who I work with, is a fantastic analyst, noted, there's, electricity consumption was declining because of, the population, old people. There was also a massive effort in 2006-07 called Cool Japan. I think it was 2006-07, where people were told not to wear suits to work in the summer to save on air conditioning. That was a big effort, right? So electricity consumption went down. It was a good thing because nuclear by 2000 hasn't been around, and nuclear used to represent about 30% of electricity production, right? So it was good that it was going down. But going forward or now is obviously TSMC is building a big plant in Kyushu, which is the southern island, and then Rapidus is also building another plant in Hokkaido, which is the northern island. And so there's quite a lot of demand for electricity going forward, which is complicating things even more, right? Because all of a sudden, AI data centers, TSMC's plant is going to require a lot of energy. Where does it all come from now? Does that kind of make sense?
You've thought about a few interesting ways to play this. So I'm starting with Mitsubishi Electric.
Yeah. So, I suppose, Mitsubishi Electric is one of our good names. I think it's exposed to the space, and, it does a lot of electronic components, etc. But I think the key thing with Mitsubishi Electric, which is another dynamic we talk about, is it's a former national champion, right? So in the old days, I think you could say it's a bit like Honeywell or Siemens It kind of, was a big bellwether name in Japan. And I think, and this will obviously, this is my opinion, not financial advice. I think it could become like the next MHI Hitachi. So MHI and Hitachi diversified plays in defense, in a variety of industries, but they started to focus on ROE. They started to focus on improving their efficiency, and they're getting rid of certain business lines, and they became darlings of the foreign community, investment community. I think Melco still has some room to go, but the share price recently moved, so I'm just a little bit apprehensive recommending it right now to your readers or followers.
Maybe wait. Let's see if this thing really is over in 2 weeks before.
Yeah, and then it's all game on, right? So, but I think this is where the opportunity is. Like in August 2024, you had that 20%. Yeah. Japan creates these opportunities, right? And you've got to have your shortlist. You've got to buy those stocks on the weakness, especially in the small cap space, because maybe, Benny, it's the passive money, but I don't know what it is. But some of these moves in the small cap names are so exaggerated that you can buy stocks on the cheap, but you need to be prepared, right? And I think, is there a chance that happens over the next few weeks? Maybe. So read Kabu Japan.
So, when I think about Japan, it was like a forgotten stock market for a while. I bought Mitsubishi Financial, MUFG, and in 2021 and beginning of 2020 for like was $4.50 or $4 or something. Yeah. And now, Rupert, we talked about Japanese banks, I don't know, a couple of shows ago, and they're obviously popular. I mean, talk about the evolution of, they were so cheap back then. Now they're just relatively cheap relative like the S&P. Or do you still see stuff that's really cheap?
Yeah, I think the banks, I think there's two things. There's valuations.
Not just the banks, anything. I'm using that as a personal example.
Yeah. So I think things aren't as cheap. I think certain things are sort of not quite priced to perfection, but they need a lot of things going right for them, such as some of the semiconductor precision equipment makers. So the electrons and the advanced tests, which, obviously American investors generally go to buy. They're great stocks. We're not negative. I'm just saying those stocks are not as cheap as they used to be. Disco, right? And the other thing you've got to think about always with Japan is positioning, right? So certain trades get really, really crowded, right? And even though they can trade $50, $100 million a day, it only takes a few orders for those stocks to go down a lot, right? So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant on the large cap names, which have been real foreign favorites. But the banks, can they keep going? I think so. But now it's less a sort of NIM story, net interest margin story, and a dividend story and a valuation story. It's now what they do. Like, can they start doing interesting M&A overseas? Can they start, is there something to do in digital banking, right? Or that kind of thing. Is there some interesting strategy with stable coins, right? So that's what I would be looking at now. And, I still own some of the banks. I prefer the regional banks because they were just cheaper, and I felt there was a big disconnect. But overall, just with some of those names, you might see a bit of volatility over the next few weeks if this situation continues in the Middle East. Is that a good answer?
So and absolutely. I mean, I've been a bit. I just own the Topex Banks Index via an ETF, sort of a bit of a lazy
That's
long,
perfect.
but you get a bit of regional exposure, but it's really sort of less than 10-12% of the overall ETF. Defense has been a major theme over the last couple of years, both sides of the sea. Well, both Korea and Japan. Japan Steelworks is your play on that. Walk us through that story.
Well, again, we actually like this name because it's exposed to defense. It's also exposed to nuclear, which I'll get to in a minute, and also produces a whole bunch of machinery for the supply chains around the world. So it's not just a pure defense play. We owned MHI, before, and we flipped into this, a few months ago. But in general, I think the defense theme is going to continue. This is one theme. I think you've got to look at names like Japan Steelworks, maybe the large cap names, because I think they will continue to do well, right? Maybe even more than the banks, right? Partly because I think strategically, obviously there's this desire to increase GDP spending on defense. At some point in the next few years, I would imagine that there is a discussion around the constitution and exports. And at some point, there's going to be a prime in Japan, just like Lockheed Martin, right? And what we are going to do this weekend is actually produce a report. Jaya is going to do it on aerospace, which is kind of related, part of it, in terms of using the precision equipment specialty and skill set as a potential growth industry in Japan, right? So defense, I think, and we will have lots of smaller component plays in defense. The big names are like MHI, but I think the foreign investors will continue to like this theme. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So like Japan Steelworks, just as an example, I'm looking at it right now. It's up 3.5 times since 2 years ago. And where does this trade, and what do you need for a story like this to keep working? You know what I mean? Because the narrative sounds good, but where's this multiple, and how are you getting paid basically? Is it just beating down earnings? Is it going to be multiple expansion? I mean, I'm just always when a stock's up 3.5 times in 2 years, I'm always curious what the thinking is.
Well, I think it is just earnings growth, and they will be the go-to contractor for a lot of this work that needs to be done. And so it's kind of an in-house supplier in Japan, I would argue. But, you're absolutely right, Benny. This is why I'm kind of cautious about going into the details. A lot of these stocks are up a lot. Yeah. So we do not want to these are things that have worked for us up until this point. Yeah. We just want to be very clear to people, if there are, there's lots of other stocks which have valuation support, significant valuation support that perhaps, in Kabu Japan we'll be covering. These are, even MHI, I think had some nuclear related news this morning, which is positive. But at the end of the day, these stocks have motored, right? So, if you're sitting there and looking at the market and you're a big institutional investor, you're up reasonably well in US dollar terms. Do these stocks face some selling pressure? Yes, right. But in terms of the general theme, which I hopefully we're just going on a theme basis here, I think the defense stuff is kind of something to, look into more detail, and we will cover it more. And in addition to that, the nuclear area, right? Because I think we were just in Japan. I was taking a UK company around who has some technology in critical metals, takes oxides out of metals. And it's amazing for the ecosystem to move away from China, sovereignty. It's very popular. We saw over 20 Japanese corporates. I came away feeling before the issue in the Middle East that there's a fire in everyone's belly, right? So what does that mean? I think it does mean that there's going to be strategic industries that are focused on. Takaichi-san has said that. And I think action is going to be taken. And this crisis that might happen will force people into certain areas. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I actually quite, it's very unfortunate, this situation, because I was coming away so bullish, and they will work their way through it. They work their way through GFC. They work their way through COVID. The civil service in Japan, I talk about this a lot. The UK used to have the Rolls-Royce civil service, in Whitehall. It's outsourced to management consultants. Now Japan doesn't have that. They kept their people, and there is a top-down approach here, and certain industries like defense are interesting. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense. I think one of the themes that you've been writing on a lot is the industrial specialization, in terms of very narrow verticals of manufacturing excellence, where businesses that you've hardly ever heard of suddenly turn out to have 80% global market shares. And you've been picking on a few of these gems over the last 6 months, Mateen. There's a lot more of that to find, isn't there? I mean, yeah,
there's a lot,
stuff, I mean, so this is a classic one that you were on the case on the substrates, but what's the process that allows you to sort of track these things down?
Well, yeah, full disclosure, I'm a geek. And then I think Jaya has geek tendencies sometimes. And so we dig into the hidden value in some of these names. And what was interesting, we picked the textile industry, which, you would say, what the hell, why are you looking at textiles? And in the early 2000s, I remember we had a textile analyst and he was let go because no one was really interested. But in the background, they were working on chemicals, glass substrates, all these things that all of a sudden...
It's just like Toto making loos, but also being a ceramic specialist and suddenly becoming an AI bottleneck the other day. That was...
Exactly.
It was great comedy value on Twitter, but actually there's an underlying serious point, is that as well as making bogs, they are specialist producers of ceramics and critical to the semiconductor value chain. And
Toto's perfect,
yeah.
So Toto is a perfect example of very specialized skills. That whole Kaizen philosophy where you're continually improving. Kind of like the thesis that Henry Ford used to have, right? Like keep improving your industrial process or procedure. They have done it, and they have some amazing technology. And they corner the market. Ajinomoto we covered, which is 2802. I think it's called Ajinomoto build-up film, which is used in AI process. They used to make MSG, right? They were a food company, right? So, and then I think, like I'm waiting for Yakult to come out with something with, I'm joking with Yakult, but Yakult does the yogurt drinks and they occasionally dabbled in derivatives back in the 2000s badly. And now presumably they'll come out with something interesting. That's not financial advice, but essentially what you have is great technologists and people who work very hard to perfect a particular niche. Now, going forward, there are so many. And in nuclear at the moment, and we have not done the full work on this disclosure, but I did buy one SMR stock, which is related to nuclear, very tiny. It's a retail stock. But for example, ultra pure water, which goes into this nuclear process, Japan kind of dominates, right? And so they've got 3 stocks, one's diversified, Kurita Water, one's Nomura, I think it's Nomura Microsciences, the other one's Organo. These things you've just got to pay attention to, because if you get them right, they rip. And the one that we traded, I didn't buy much of it, was Hamamatsu Photonics, 6965. Again, photonics, it's very niche sort of tech area. Jaya is an expert. I'm just sort of the lipstick on the pig here. But we bought it because it looked like it was going to go up. And it did go up, right? And photonics is an area where Japan dominates. But the photonics, what they do, goes into the nuclear supply chain, right? So you've got to dig a bit deeper, and then you can find real winners, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, and actually sticking with nuclear, the Japan Steelworks story, they're about the only manufacturer of reactor vessels globally. I mean, how many are there in that game? Right.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Yes, there aren't that many in this game. And the thing is, with Japanese nuclear technology, if Toshiba tried to get involved with Westinghouse in 2006 or something, they bought it and it paid the wrong price and all that sort of stuff. But if you didn't have Fukushima, Japan would be leading the world in nuclear technology now, right? They were quite advanced, right? And I think more than the French, more than maybe the Germans sort of gave up on nuclear as well. So does that all come back? Is there a renaissance? I think there might be, and it's not something we can be firm on. Like, we haven't done the work yet because it's very current. But, generally people will probably recommend the utility companies which own the reactors. What we want to talk about are the components and find one or two components that end up being a part of the US strategy. Japan can also supply the US, can supply here. And I think that's where you get a bit of alpha in Japan.
Let me ask you a question. What is the current mix of nuclear? I know it was like almost up to 30% when it was Fukushima. Was it like gotten cut in half, or how much?
Oh, it's minuscule. I think it's a few percent now. I think
like five
I
or
think it's
6% or something like that.
Yeah. So it's came in 2014. I think it was non-existent, right? And then it's come back. Abe came in and he said, we've got to do something about this. We need nuclear. That was sort of 2013, 14. And then slowly the reactors have come on. I think there's about, don't quote me, but maybe 13 on. TEPCO has just brought one on recently. That, they have to do this. They have to embrace it. The other thing they could do, I think, Japan, I was thinking about this yesterday, is they have signed this deal with the US. They could have something similar with Australia. At the moment, the trading companies are really dominant in LNG. They're the ones organizing LNG and coking coal and things like that. Could Japan and Australia have a similar framework? Because Australia's got a lot of what Japan needs, including critical minerals, right? So there's a bunch of policy decisions that could be made to, hopefully sort this problem out going forward.
Well, let me ask you another question.
Go ahead, Betty.
No, I just wanted I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and I was just thinking about, do you have a view on SoftBank? We're talking about nuclear and power and data centers, and I know that they're very levered to the space.
Before we go there, I just wanted to say, just on this industrial policy stuff, you mentioned the strength of the civil service and the men in grey suits that will make sure these wheels keep turning. How important is the politics? Because obviously Takaichi's son, she's incredibly popular right now, but things can change in Japanese politics so quickly. And does that derail all of this industrial policy stuff that you're talking about?
No, I think within the LDP, I think there's cohesion around this. I think I think when she came to power, we argued that she was more like Prime Minister Nakasone of 1986, rather than, say, Koizumi in 2005 and Abe-san, in that she was able to bring the LDP party together, right? And at that time also, the Socialist Party in 90 days was quite weak. And so the opposition was pitiful this time around for her. Very easy competition. The other thing that was similar is that Nakasone made efforts to improve the relationship with the US. Takaichi-san is doing the same. But the problem with that is, as so it's all looking reasonably positive, right? But prime ministers don't last long in Japan. And if this crisis on inflation gets worse, she might get the blame. What she did to bring the party together, she put some of her opponents in very senior positions in the LDP. Koizumi, the son of the former prime ministers in defense, for example. I mean, it's a tricky road she's got to travel right now. So, but I think as a whole, there is an awareness across the factions, if they exist anymore in the LDP, that they need to have a cohesive policy here. Does that make sense? And I think METI, which is one of the civil service groups, very famous in the 1980s, it kind of lost its mojo in the 1990s, right? I think it's back. And I think Abe-san kind of made that so. And they've been very important in coming up with the M&A guidelines and the how to deal with private equity. They are becoming more and more dominant. We met some officials. I can't tell you how smart they are, right? They are smart global people who want Japan to win, right? And I think that's very important, that cohesion going forward. Even if there is a crisis, it doesn't mean that it's all over. Make sense? Yeah.
Yep, makes perfect sense. Benny, crazy massa, you wanted to talk SoftBank.
I mean, it's always fun to talk about, so I'd just like to hear if you have an opinion there.
SoftBank's the one I try to avoid. I did see his
Yeah,
apartment.
yeah.
I did see his apartment, went to his apartment. I know saw where he lived. He obviously lives in a big house, and there's an apartment down near Roppongi, and it's on like 700th floor or something in that new building. Incidentally, Tokyo is becoming nicer and nicer every time you go. It's just better and better to live there and hang around and everything. But SoftBank is a tricky one for me because I'm kind of bearish on Silicon Valley, if I'm honest. And I am dubious about his spending habits. I think he was great once. I wonder whether he's getting a bit senile. Is that controversial? But I think he's sort of enamored with everything Silicon Valley, and I struggle with Silicon Valley these days. I don't particularly think the valuations are worth it. I think the IPO market's not going to be particularly good this year, and I think he's going to have a tough time. So I've probably alienated half of the people watching this now. So anyway, that's what I think. So I try to avoid SoftBank, but to be honest, Benny, SoftBank's a great stock to trade, right? Because you can, obviously I haven't got the money, but if you're an institution, it's very easy. It trades like water. If I'm completely wrong and things are moving again, you can just come in there and buy $20-30. It does not matter, right? That's why I think it's a good stock to always watch. But for me, it's hard to have an edge.
Yeah, it's a unique stock. I mean, Rupert was talking about the IPO market recently on I think it was our last show, actually. You want to talk about that a little bit, Rupert?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was thinking about the US IPO pipeline in the context of SpaceX, Anthropic, OpenAI, tipping potentially $100 to $130 billion of new supply on a market in the US that has stopped de-equitizing, right? Now that the buybacks are drying up, now that the M&A flows are slowing up. I mean, we talked about this before, and actually I put a slide in here, which is maybe the IPO market to watch is Asia, and specifically Hong Kong this year. I mean, I think the US IPO calendar is going to be a hot mess, and it may even take the whole market down with it, in an extreme view. Whereas Hong Kong's just getting going.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And shout out to Charlotte, who helped me with last week's thing. She was fantastic, very clever. We did analysis of the IPO market for Discuss the Tape in Hong Kong. And it's clear to me that I feel, right, that 2026 is the time when we realize just how far China's come from 2017. Does that make sense technologically? I think I was on the Market Huddle and I talked positively about China in January, and people accused me of working for the Chinese government. It makes me laugh. Obviously, I haven't been to China since 2007, I think. But essentially, what's happened is huge. When you look at the IPO market, if you Discuss the Tape, we've got some issues in there. They're not particularly expensive versus their revenues in terms of market cap, potential market cap. And I feel that it's probably the best show in town, especially as Europe is kind of pitiful, right? There's not much in ECM in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't agree. I don't disagree with you about the prospect for the calendar out of China. What I would say, and I'm writing about this weekend, is China tech, well, in fact, EM tech generally has not been working for about 6 months. In fact, the draft title of my report for this weekend is "Doc, my EM tech is sick."
Yeah,
but you've obviously got things like ByteDance potentially coming, which will be the clear sort of AI winner. The existing sort of Baba, Tencent, Baidu sort of complex is not viewed as sort of crushing it. Although I actually have a view that they're doing much better and their approach is much more sensible longer term. But the stocks aren't working relative to EM generally, right? I just wondered if you had a take on that and whether you think that impacts demand for what is, I agree, a pretty exciting pipeline.
In terms of EM tech, we're bullish Brazil, but we've only played that through ETFs, I'm afraid. So it's not necessarily, we're not going down to the singular stocks. In terms of Chinese tech, I think there's just generally a lack of awareness. I think with a lot of foreign investors, I struggle sometimes when I speak to them, and it feels very much like even Japan was like in a few years ago. Like I took a fund around Australia, which was Japan focused. No one cared, right? And you were saying, look, guys, this is going to happen. It's going to be big. And everyone's like not interested. And I feel like, when David Tepper in 2024 in September came out and said, bye, like David Tepper's smart, right? Like he plays for the recovery, right? And he did in 2009. I think obviously it's been a longer journey on Chinese stocks, but some of these names are cheap, right? So JD.com and, they've got lots of cash. And then the other factor that I think is something that's missing in discussions is what they can do with buybacks. So I argued that Baidu was the biggest story the last few weeks. It could be like AutoZone. Remember AutoZone in the States, which just kept going up? And
so interesting, Baidu's one of the three that actually has worked in the past year, right?
Okay,
just as it got written off by everyone. So I looked at this. So the Chinternet stocks collectively, right, have got the constituents within the EMQQ, which is the Nasdaq of the triple Qs of emerging markets. Collectively, they've got $120 billion of cash on their balance sheets right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
But some of that, just to be fair, there's a caveat there because just so you know, Mateen, Rupert and I met each other over China. I was a big China bull when it was very out of popular in late 23, early 24, and I found Rupert, and he was we were like-minded in that sense. But I'll just give you an example. Like Alibaba, it has a lot of offshore cash, right? So there's always this concern, can they basically, how much can they buy back because they don't want to bring it back home because then maybe the Chinese banks, absorb it. So there is some nuances to that and where the cash sits, I think.
And it's a good point, but I also think that China's, in their reforms in September 24, these companies can borrow to buy back stocks, right? So it's a fantastic mechanism. It's just, I feel like, if Japan had done something similar in, not necessarily in the 90s because it was on its knees, but earlier, like what they did with 2010, but stock market focused things, then Japan's equity market have done much better. I feel like China's done something very proactive here, but it's not necessarily getting enough attention. Does that make sense, Benny?
Yeah, they just had a headline I saw today that they were starting to encourage companies to buy back stock, and that was something I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I wasn't. Maybe
no. That's been around for a while, but it's now finally starting to happen. I mean, I was expecting to see much more capital allocation discussion in the year end earnings reports. Maybe we just have to wait a tiny bit longer.
Yeah. And I've got a feeling that obviously who knows, Benny and Rupert, what's going to happen with this Middle East thing, but I'm buying some of these like Hong Kong listed names because I feel, and JD.com ADR, because I feel that out of nowhere we could get a rally and a proper move in some of these names, and it's a feeling rather than a recommendation. So non-financial advice, but they've been on their knees for too long, and they're too cheap. And I feel like at this stage, I think we are not fully understanding just how JD.com, PDD are going to dominate global retail, right? Like they've got the lowest marginal cost production. They've got a machine behind the interface, right? And I think they're making strides in Europe. And so I think it's worth just having a look at them. Does that make sense? I'm not saying I'm going to be right, but
I can't.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I think that's right. I mean, I own Baidu and Baba. I got involved in, and I've been in and out of Baba. Like last summer when we had that move, and it seems as though people we had that move in July, August, and it's kind of just faded. And now it seems like every single person is in Korea basically, although they've had a rough couple days here. But yeah,
that's exactly it, Benny. I think that's like, it's kind of like, well, Korea, and you see money flow.
Japan's had a really nice run too. So if I'm like if I'm an American or I'm a foreigner and I'm looking for Asian equity exposure, Japan and Korea. I mean, Korea's been outrageous, but they easy come, easy go. The Nikkei's down 10% and Korean market's down 15, whatever. So there's some volatility there, but those are definitely the most popular markets, for Asian.
Well, I tell you, the Chinese tech story has felt bidless since October. I went to go and see. So I joined a gang of people like us and investors on a trip to Shenzhen last October, and we went to go and see Tencent. And I've been a 10-cent long since the lows in Halloween of 2022, right? And it had grown to become sort of largest single stock position in the portfolio, and I was kind of getting itchy feet, saying maybe I should be owning some other stuff. Done fine, but I then went to this open day and sort of fell in love again. Thought that there was a decacorn hiding behind every corner. There's so much value left to come. It's literally been down almost every day since that visit. There's always a lesson. Never visit management teams or go on site tours. It gets you far too heavily wedded to the story. But I finally sort of cut back that position aggressively in the last couple of weeks. I think with these names, I think you'll get a chance to react. Again, they're super liquid names. You're not going to get left behind. I think you can just wait for the charts to look a little bit kinder.
And that's kind of how I'm approaching. Like, I might be completely wrong with what's happening in the Middle East, but if it turns, we're going to have a massive move higher, so you can jump in again, right? And so that's wait for the market to give us an indication. The trouble with, I think I'm wedded to this story now with China tech. I feel like an obligation to buy them if they go or come off a bit longer. That again, Rupert, I might be making a big mistake, but in general, I think the Chinese.
Well, I think it's good to have it's good to have a few shares on the sheets, just so that you get the alarm call when they do move.
Yes,
right?
Correct. Yeah.
Rather than just averaging down forever, Mateen.
That's right. Until oblivion. But I think Hong Kong, I've said this time and time again, and the unfortunate events in Dubai, I think, are going to make this probably more likely. I think Hong Kong does become, again, a much more vibrant capital market center in the world. And, can it at some point rival NASDAQ? Of course, it's a long way off, but I think when we were there, probably in 2000, I was there 2007, 8 or whatever, everyone was talking about Hong Kong becoming the new New York. And you're like, that's just nonsense. But, can it become much more relevant now, right? It's kind of working in some ways, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? And so at the moment, everyone pushes back on me and says, that's rubbish, and a few weeks ago, Dubai is the future. But I think Hong Kong's still got quite a lot going for it. And there are just too many good companies, too many clever Chinese technologists working on stuff to ignore it, right? And I think everyone's going to park their sort of general sort of, predisposition to think X, Y, and Z and just think, I want to make some money here. I think the stocks will go higher at some point. Non-financial advice, of course.
Yeah, I think, gosh, you're wearing out that not financial advice. I think there are parts of the China market that are working right now. So, the A shares are working very well. right? The A shares, the A shares are trending beautifully. It's really the traditional sort of large cap tech stocks that are dragging everyone down. The power companies, the utilities, the sort of boring stuff is working really well, and and the banks are working well. I mean, also ultimately, I think we're in the home of central planning. The stocks that the party want to work are working fine.
Right. Yeah. And I think
they keep on talking about a boring bull market. That's not quite the expression they use. They want the steady bull market, right? High yielding utilities and banks trading up a few clicks a day is exactly what they want. And eventually people will notice that, and they're going to reach for the big tech stocks. And maybe it takes that IPO calendar to go, wow, we're paying a nosebleed valuation for ByteDance. Look what I can get Tencent for, right? Maybe that's what brings the flow back.
Yeah. Excellent point. Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah.
Even our BYD is now kind of like taking a 30-40% correction, Rupert. That was our first stock together, buddy.
That was our moment, Benny. That was our moment.
It was.
BYD, we met over BYD, Mateen. I went to go and see BYD in Shenzhen as well. I mean, my takeaway from that is, it could be one of the most impressive companies on the planet by a mile, but it feels like a terrible stock at the moment because anything touching the global automotive industry feels like a terrible stock to me right now.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So, so I think there's this, but of course, you've got to watch the tape every day. We're not, but I think in general, China's actually getting some of this stuff right. And I think at some point people will start to realize that. Yeah, that's the point.
Okay. Well, listen, we're coming up for the hour, Mateen. 30 seconds to shill your products here. I mean, I'm a huge fan of your stuff. You write beautifully. The new Kabu product with Jaya and Talon is superb, and you've been hitting it out of the park with some of your calls. Quick refresher. How to find you, what to do.
Oh, okay. So we're on Substack, Discuss the Tape, and Substack for Kabu Japan. Both have a X account, although I must say I don't really put too much on Discuss the Tape. But Talon and Jaya are putting a lot now on these social media platforms. But we would love anyone, if they're interested in Japan or just general discussions about broader markets, to subscribe to both newsletters, if that's okay.
Perfect. Mateen, I gather you're heading up the coast after we finish this. Have a wonderful, well-earned break with Mrs. Chaudhry. Anything you want to add, Benny?
No, I think we can leave it there. We appreciate you coming on, buddy. It was nice to meet you. And yeah, I mean, we should check back in, down the road and see how things are playing out. Because I do think, look, again, I think the yen's going to get weaker, and I think that the Japanese market is going to be interesting for a while. It's finally, it was in the penalty box for how long? 30 years. So it could be a new era.
Yeah, it just coincided with my career when it was in the penalty box. Yeah, so story of my life.
Yeah, it's always the case, isn't it? Well, listen, thanks, buddy. Really enjoyed it. I think your message about keeping shopping lists to the ready in case we get a liquidity event, I think is well made and well taken. Thanks so much for joining us. Mateen, Benny, and the Squirrel out.